In a glass-walled conference room in downtown Seattle, a pregnant marketing executive was about to make a request that would destroy her boss's career. What started as a routine maternity leave discussion took a shocking turn when she came face to face with public humiliation and discrimination. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical corporate employee. For 5 years, she had built her reputation through meticulous research and unwavering dedication to truth. When her boss, Richard Hartwell, laughed at her maternity leave request, she had no idea she was walking into a web of lies that would unravel decades of fraud and spark a national movement for workplace justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell smoothed her navy maternity blouse one final time and pressed her hand against the gentle curve of her belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had become her constant companion these past few weeks. 6 months pregnant and still radiant with the glow of impending motherhood, she had spent the morning rehearsing this conversation in her mind. It should have been routine, a simple request for the maternity leave that was legally mandated and morally reasonable. She had earned it through 5 years of unwavering dedication to Sterling and Associates, climbing from entry-level marketing coordinator to senior executive through sheer determination and countless late nights. The glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor offered a commanding view of downtown Seattle, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the gray October sky that seemed to mirror Sarah's growing apprehension. Inside, Richard Hartwell held court with his usual audience of admirers and sycophants, 3 other senior executives who hung on his every word as if he were dispensing corporate gospel rather than the self-aggrandizing anecdotes that had become his trademark during these informal strategy sessions. Hartwell himself cut an imposing figure at the head of the polished mahogany table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Harvard Business School class ring catching the fluorescent light as he gestured expansively. At 52, he possessed the kind of practiced charisma that had propelled him through the corporate ranks, though Sarah had always sensed something performative about his confidence, as if he were constantly auditioning for a role he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. "Sarah!" Hartwell's voice boomed as she knocked on the glass door, his smile appearing instantly, but somehow never quite reaching his eyes. Come in. We were just discussing the Morrison account." He gestured to an empty chair with theatrical magnanimity, though Sarah noticed he made no move to pause the meeting or suggest a private conversation. The other executives, Tom Bradley from operations, Lisa Chen from finance, and Robert Park from business development, offered polite nods, but quickly returned their attention to Hartwell, clearly uncomfortable with any interruption to their carefully choreographed morning ritual. Sarah had worked with all of them for years, had shared countless strategy sessions and client presentations, yet in this moment, she felt like an intruder in her own workplace. "Actually, Richard," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her, "I was hoping we could discuss my maternity leave arrangements. I know we've touched on it briefly, but I wanted to formalize the timeline and transition plans." The change in Hartwell's expression was subtle but unmistakable, the practiced smile faltering just enough to reveal a flash of irritation before reassembling itself into something that looked more like amusement. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that somehow managed to sound condescending. "Maternity leave," he repeated, as if the words were foreign to him. "Right, of course. The baby situation." His eyes flicked to her belly with undisguised distaste before returning to her face. "Tell me, Sarah, how exactly do you plan to maintain your commitment to the Morrison account while you're indisposed?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, partly from embarrassment and partly from a growing anger she hadn't expected. Around the table, the other executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes finding sudden fascination with their coffee cups and smartphones. "Well," Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice professional, I've been developing comprehensive transition documents for all my active accounts. Jennifer Walsh handled similar transitions beautifully before her departure, and I plan to follow that model. The Family and Medical Leave Act provides for 12 weeks of protected leave, and I was hoping to discuss. Hartwell's laugh cut through her words like a blade, sharp and dismissive. It wasn't the kind of laugh that invited others to join in. It was the laugh of someone who found the very premise of the conversation absurd. The sound echoed off the glass walls of the conference room, and Sarah felt as though it were broadcasting her humiliation to the entire floor. "The mommy track," Hartwell said, shaking his head with exaggerated sympathy. Sarah. I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but when you decided to get pregnant, did you consider the impact on your career trajectory? On your team? On the clients who depend on your expertise? The questions weren't really questions at all, and everyone in the room knew it. They were accusations wrapped in the thin veneer of concern, designed to make Sarah feel guilty for the biological reality of pregnancy and the legal right to family leave. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears, could sense the discomfort radiating from her colleagues who were witnessing this character assassination disguised as mentorship. "Richard," Sarah said, her voice quieter now but with an edge of steel she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm requesting the leave that's guaranteed by federal law. I've never missed a deadline, never failed to exceed my targets, and I've been with this company for 5 years. I think I've earned the right to start a family without having my commitment questioned." Hartwell's smile turned predatory. "Oh, commitment. That's an interesting word choice." He turned to address the other executives as if Sarah weren't sitting right there. "You know, it's fascinating how priorities change. One day you have a dedicated team member who lives and breathes the client relationship, and the next day they're talking about 12 weeks off and reduced schedules and pumping rooms." He said the last phrase with barely concealed disgust. "Actually," Tom Bradley interjected weakly, "the Morrison account is in good shape. Sarah's really—" "Tom, please," Hartwell cut him off with a wave of his hand. "I know you're trying to be supportive, but let's be realistic here. Sarah's about to become a mother. That's wonderful, truly. But let's not pretend that her focus won't be divided, that her loyalty won't be split between her baby and her career, that she won't be thinking about daycare schedules and pediatrician appointments when she should be thinking about quarterly projections and client retention strategies." Each word felt like a physical blow, and Sarah found herself placing a protective hand over her belly, as if she could shield her unborn daughter from the toxic atmosphere that was suffocating her own professional aspirations. The baby kicked, as if in response, a small reminder of the life growing inside her that had brought such joy, and now seemed to have painted a target on her career. "Furthermore," Hartwell continued, warming to his theme, "I have to consider what's best for the team. What kind of message does it send when we accommodate every little life change? What about the people who've chosen to remain focused on their careers? Are we being fair to them when we redistribute Sarah's responsibilities while she's off playing house?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked around the table at her colleagues, people she had considered friends, mentors, allies, and saw only averted gazes and uncomfortable fidgeting. Nobody was going to speak up. Nobody was going to defend her. In that moment, she realized that the company culture she had believed in, the meritocracy she had trusted to reward her hard work and dedication, was nothing more than an elaborate fiction designed to protect men like Hartwell while systematically undermining women like her. "I see," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood slowly, her hand still pressed against her belly, and gathered the portfolio of transition documents she had spent weeks preparing. I'll follow up with HR about the formal paperwork." "You do that," Hartwell said, his attention already turning back to the others as if she had ceased to exist. "Now, about the Morrison account, I think we need to start looking at contingency plans." Sarah walked out of the conference room on unsteady legs, her face burning with humiliation, and her mind reeling from the casual cruelty she had just experienced. Behind her, she could hear Hartwell's voice rising again, already moving on to other topics, as if the destruction of her professional dignity had been merely an amusing interlude in his day. As she made her way back to her office, past the cubicles, and corner offices where her colleagues studiously avoided eye contact, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. The naive faith she had placed in corporate fairness, the belief that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded with basic human decency, crumbled like an old foundation unable to bear the weight of reality. But in its place, something harder and more determined was beginning to take root. For the first time in her 5 years at Sterling & Associates, Sarah Mitchell was truly angry. And as she sank into her desk chair and stared at her computer screen without really seeing it, she made a promise to herself and to the daughter growing inside her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sound of David's key in the front door came earlier than usual that evening. Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been staring at the same quarterly report for the past hour, without absorbing a single word. She quickly closed the computer and wiped at her eyes, hoping to compose herself before her husband saw the evidence of her afternoon breakdown. "Hey, beautiful," David called from the entryway, his voice carrying that warm affection that had sustained their 5-year marriage through every challenge they'd faced. How did the meeting with Hartwell go? The question hit her like a physical blow, and despite her best efforts, Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure crumble. The tears came immediately, hot, angry tears that had been building pressure behind her eyes all day. David appeared in the living room doorway within seconds, his software engineer's analytical mind immediately processing the scene. His pregnant wife collapsed on their couch, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, still wearing her work clothes at 7 o'clock in the evening. "Sarah, what happened?" He was beside her instantly, his arms encircling her with the gentle protectiveness that had made her fall in love with him during their college years at Washington State. His dark hair was still slightly mussed from running his hands through it, a nervous habit that intensified whenever he was debugging particularly stubborn code, or in this case, trying to understand what had upset his wife. Through halting words punctuated by fresh waves of tears, Sarah recounted the humiliation in the conference room. She told him about Hartwell's dismissive laughter, about the mommy track comment that had cut through her professional confidence like a blade. She described the faces of her colleagues, people she had considered allies, and how they had sat in uncomfortable silence while she was verbally eviscerated for the crime of wanting to bond with their daughter. David's jaw tightened with each detail, his programmer's logical mind struggling to process the illogical cruelty his wife had endured. "That bastard," he muttered, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry, I know you don't like me cursing around the baby." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling through her tears. "I think she can handle it, especially considering what her mother went through today." "This isn't legal, Sarah. What he said, how he treated you, there are laws against this kind of discrimination." David was already reaching for his phone, his fingers flying across the screen with the same precision he brought to writing code. The Family and Medical Leave Act, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. He can't just mock you for requesting legally protected time off. Sarah watched her husband research employment law with the same methodical intensity he applied to solving complex software problems, and felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced since walking out of that conference room. David had always been her intellectual equal, but where she excelled at creative marketing strategies and relationship building, he thrived on data analysis and systematic problem-solving. "Look at this," David said, holding up his phone. "According to the EEOC, it is unlawful to harass a woman because of pregnancy, childbirth, or a medical condition related to pregnancy or childbirth. What Hartwell did today, That's textbook harassment. But how do I prove it? Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder and feeling some of the day's tension begin to ease. It's my word against his, and everyone else in that room. They're not going to back me up. Their careers depend on staying in Hartwell's good graces. David was quiet for a moment, his analytical mind churning through possibilities. You said he mentioned his Harvard MBA specifically when he was talking about commitment and focus. That's always struck me as odd. What do you mean? I mean, most people don't name-drop their alma mater quite so frequently. It's like he's constantly reminding everyone where he went to school. David's fingers were moving across his phone screen again. When did he graduate? Sarah thought back through conversations she'd overheard, trying to recall specific details. I think he always says 1995. He makes jokes about being an old-school Harvard man whenever someone suggests updating our marketing strategies. Harvard Business School, class of 1995, David murmured, typing rapidly. Let me see what I can find. What he found, after 20 minutes of systematic searching through alumni directories, LinkedIn profiles, and Harvard's official records, was nothing. No Richard Hartwell in the MBA program. No Richard Hartwell in any graduate program. In fact, the only academic record they could find for their Richard Hartwell was a 2-year associate degree from Tacoma Community College in 1993. That can't be right, Sarah said, leaning over to look at David's screen. He talks about Harvard constantly. His office is full of Harvard memorabilia. That class ring he's always playing with. Anyone can buy a class ring online, David said grimly. And Harvard merchandise isn't exactly restricted to alumni. He continued typing, following digital breadcrumbs with the persistence that made him excellent at debugging. Look at this. His LinkedIn profile claims he worked at McKinsey & Company from 1995 to 1998, right after his supposed Harvard graduation. More searching revealed more inconsistencies. The McKinsey alumni network had no record of Richard Hartwell. His claimed position at Goldman Sachs from 1998 to 2002 couldn't be verified through any official channels. Even his supposed role at a boutique consulting firm in Portland seemed to exist only in his own professional narrative. This is insane, Sarah whispered, staring at the evidence of systematic deception that David had uncovered in less than an hour. His entire professional background is fabricated. It looks that way. The question is, what do we do with this information? Sarah felt a transformation beginning inside her, similar to what she'd experienced in the conference room, but in reverse. Where Hartwell's cruelty had shattered her faith in corporate fairness, this discovery was rebuilding it into something harder and more purposeful. The man who had humiliated her for wanting to be a mother, who had questioned her commitment and professionalism, was himself living a complete lie. We investigate further, she said, her voice carrying a steel resolve that surprised them both. If he's lying about Harvard and McKinsey, what else is he lying about? And more importantly, how many other women has he treated the way he treated me today? David nodded slowly, recognizing the determined gleam in his wife's eyes that appeared whenever she was about to tackle a particularly challenging marketing campaign. You know this could be dangerous, right? If he's built his entire career on lies, he's not going to react well to being exposed. I know. Sarah placed her hand on her belly, feeling their daughter's gentle movement. But I can't let him keep doing this. Not to me, not to other women, and not while representing this company. Our daughter deserves to grow up in a world where women don't have to choose between having children and having careers. As they sat together on their couch, surrounded by the detritus of David's impromptu investigation, legal websites still open on his laptop, printed screenshots scattered across their coffee table, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her old self disappearing. The compliant employee who had trusted in corporate fairness was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. Someone who understood that justice wasn't something that would be handed to her, but something she would have to fight for. The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time since walking out of that conference room, Sarah Mitchell felt like she had the weapons to fight back. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she typed the carefully worded message on LinkedIn the next morning. She had spent most of the night crafting and recrafting the request, knowing she would only get one chance to reach out to Jennifer Walsh without raising suspicions. The message needed to sound casual, professional, yet urgent enough to prompt a response from someone who had every reason to avoid anything connected to Sterling and Associates. Hi, Jennifer. I hope you're doing well in your consulting work. Was wondering if you might have time for coffee this week. I'm dealing with some workplace challenges and could really use the perspective of someone who understands the corporate landscape. Would love to catch up and hear about your new ventures. Best, Sarah. The response came faster than expected. Within 2 hours, Jennifer had suggested a small cafe in Fremont, far from the downtown business district where they might encounter colleagues. Sarah spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work while avoiding Hartwell, who seemed to be watching her with increased scrutiny since their disastrous meeting. The Grind Coffee House was exactly the kind of place Jennifer would choose, tucked away on a residential street, populated by freelancers with laptops rather than business executives in suits. Sarah arrived 10 minutes early and claimed a corner table, her pregnancy making her hyper-aware of every entrance and exit in case she needed to leave quickly. Jennifer Walsh looked different than Sarah remembered. Gone was the polished corporate armor of tailored suits and carefully styled hair. Instead, she wore dark jeans and a simple sweater, her auburn hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that somehow made her look both younger and more tired. At 34, Jennifer had been one of the rising stars at Sterling and Associates before her abrupt departure 2 years ago. A departure that had been explained away with vague references to pursuing new opportunities. Sarah, Jennifer said as she approached the table, her voice carrying a warmth that didn't quite mask an underlying wariness. You look wonderful. Pregnancy suits you. Thank you for meeting me, Sarah replied, standing to embrace her former colleague. I wasn't sure you'd want to, given how things ended at Sterling. Jennifer's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Water under the bridge, she said, though her tone suggested the water might still be quite turbulent. She ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and settled into the chair across from Sarah with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to get too comfortable anywhere. For the first few minutes, they engaged in the ritual dance of small talk. Jennifer's consulting business was growing steadily, focusing on organizational development for mid-sized companies. She was dating someone new, a graphic designer who understood the demands of entrepreneurial life. She asked about Sarah's pregnancy, about David, about mutual acquaintances still working at Sterling. But Sarah could see the questions lurking behind Jennifer's careful professionalism. Finally, unable to maintain the pretense any longer, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. Jennifer, I need to ask you something, and I understand if you don't want to discuss it. But what really happened between you and the company? Why did you leave? The change in Jennifer's demeanor was immediate and stark. Her shoulders tensed, her hands tightened around her coffee cup, and her eyes took on the distant look of someone revisiting a traumatic memory. For a long moment, Sarah thought she might refuse to answer, might gather her things and leave rather than reopening old wounds. Richard Hartwell happened, Jennifer said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The name hung between them, like a curse. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain still, to let Jennifer find her own way into the story that had clearly been weighing on her for 2 years. It started slowly, Jennifer continued, her gaze fixed on something beyond Sarah's shoulder. Comments about my appearance, suggestions that I might advance faster if I were more collaborative with senior management. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. You know how it is. You second-guess yourself, wonder if you're reading too much into innocent remarks. Sarah nodded, recognizing the terrible familiarity of that self-doubt. Then it escalated. He started finding excuses to keep me late for strategy sessions that turned into personal conversations about his marriage problems. He'd stand, too, close during presentations, put his hand on my shoulder or back in ways that felt inappropriate, but weren't obvious enough to call out. Jennifer's voice grew steadier as she spoke, as if the act of finally telling the story was somehow liberating. I tried to handle it professionally. I documented everything, avoided being alone with him, kept our interactions focused on work. But he was relentless. And when I finally went to HR, Jennifer laughed bitterly. Marcus Thompson was very sympathetic, very concerned, very committed to investigating thoroughly and ensuring a safe workplace for everyone. What happened? Nothing, absolutely nothing. The investigation consisted of Marcus having a friendly chat with Hartwell, who expressed shock and concern that I might have misinterpreted his mentorship style. Suddenly, I was the problem employee who couldn't handle normal workplace interactions. My performance reviews became nitpicking exercises. Projects I'd been leading were reassigned. I was systematically marginalized until leaving became the only viable option. Sarah felt sick, recognizing the same pattern of institutional protection that had allowed Hartwell to humiliate her with impunity. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Of course you didn't. That's how it works. They isolate you, make you feel like you're the only one, like it must be your fault somehow." Jennifer studied Sarah's face carefully. "But something tells me you didn't ask me here just to reminisce about my unfortunate departure. What's Hartwell done to you?" Sarah recounted the previous day's humiliation, watching Jennifer's expression grow darker with each detail. When she described Hartwell's comments about the mommy track and playing house, Jennifer's hands clenched into fists. "That bastard," Jennifer muttered. "He's gotten worse, if that's possible. At least with me, he tried to maintain some pretense of propriety. What he did to you was blatantly illegal." "There's more," Sarah said, and told Jennifer about their discovery of Hartwell's fabricated credentials. Jennifer's eyes widened as Sarah detailed the missing Harvard MBA, the non-existent McKinsey position, the trail of professional lies that seemed to stretch back decades. "Jesus," Jennifer whispered. "I knew something was off about him, but I never imagined." She was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "Sarah, do you realize what this means? If his entire professional identity is fabricated, then everything he's achieved at Sterling is built on fraud. Every promotion, every client relationship, every decision he's made, it's all been under false pretenses." "I know. The question is, what do we do about it?" Jennifer leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely energized. "We expose him. We make sure everyone knows exactly who Richard Hartwell really is and what he's done to women at that company." "But Sarah," her expression grew serious, "you need to understand what you're getting into. Hartwell isn't going to go quietly. He'll fight dirty, try to destroy your reputation, maybe even your marriage. Are you prepared for that?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah thought about her unborn daughter, about the world she wanted to create for her, about all the other women who might face Hartwell's abuse if no one stood up to him. "I'm prepared," she said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. Jennifer smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her all afternoon. "Good, because I've been waiting 2 years for someone with the courage to take that son of a bitch down, and I know exactly how we can do it." As they left the cafe together, Sarah felt the weight of partnership, of no longer fighting alone. The scared, isolated woman from yesterday's conference room was disappearing, replaced by someone with allies, resources, and most importantly, a plan for justice. The home office that David had set up in their spare bedroom had been transformed into something resembling a detective's war room. 3 laptops hummed quietly on the expanded desk surface, their screens displaying spreadsheets, browser windows, and document folders that represented weeks of methodical investigation. Sarah sat in the ergonomic chair David had insisted on buying for her pregnancy, while he perched on a folding chair they'd borrowed from the kitchen, his programmer's focus entirely absorbed by the puzzle of Richard Hartwell's fabricated life. It was nearly midnight on a Friday, 3 weeks after Sarah's meeting with Jennifer. What had started as casual fact-checking had evolved into something far more comprehensive and damning. The deeper they dug, the more elaborate Hartwell's deception revealed itself to be. "Look at this," David said, pointing to a timeline he'd constructed in Excel. According to his LinkedIn profile, he was working at McKinsey in Boston from 1995 to 1998. But I found property records showing he was renting an apartment in Spokane during that same period. He was actually working at a small regional marketing firm called Northwest Solutions. Sarah leaned over to examine the evidence, feeling their daughter kick as she shifted position. Even at 7 months pregnant, she'd insisted on being present for every discovery, every revelation that peeled back another layer of Hartwell's lies. "How did you find the property records?" "Public databases. Once you know what to look for, it's not that hard to trace someone's actual history." David's voice carried the satisfaction of a programmer who'd successfully debugged a particularly complex problem. "The interesting thing is, he wasn't terrible at that job. I found some local business articles mentioning his work on a few successful campaigns. He was competent, maybe even good, but apparently that wasn't enough." Jennifer's voice came through the speakerphone from her own apartment across town. She'd become their 3rd team member, contributing her insider knowledge of Sterling and associates and her experience with corporate investigations. "The pattern makes sense," she said. "He was probably a decent mid-level employee who got tired of being overlooked. So he invented a background that would open doors." "But how did he get away with it for so long?" Sarah asked, scrolling through another set of documents. "Don't companies do background checks?" "They do now," David replied, pulling up a new browser window. But Hartwell joined Sterling in 2005, when background verification was less rigorous, especially for senior hires. If someone presented well in interviews and had convincing references, many companies took resumes at face value. The references, they'd discovered, were perhaps the most ingenious part of Hartwell's deception. He'd cultivated a network of accomplices, former colleagues who'd agreed to vouch for positions he'd never held, in exchange for similar favors. It was a reciprocal system of professional fraud that had sustained itself for nearly 2 decades. "I've been thinking about the Harvard ring," Sarah said, turning to a folder of printed screenshots. "It's not just any class ring. It's specifically designed to look like the 1995 MBA program ring. Jennifer, you mentioned he wore it constantly at the office?" "Every day. He'd fidget with it during meetings, especially when he was about to make some pronouncement about strategy or market analysis. It was like a talisman." David had found the ring's source within hours of beginning that particular search thread. Custom jewelry website called Elite Academic Reproductions. They specialize in replica class rings, fraternity jewelry, military insignia, anything that suggests prestige or accomplishment. 5-star reviews from customers who want to reclaim lost jewelry or honor family traditions. The Harvard memorabilia in Hartwell's office told a similar story. The diploma was a high-quality forgery purchased from the same underground network that provided fake transcripts to desperate job seekers. The framed photos of him supposedly at Harvard Business School events were cleverly manipulated images, real photos from Harvard events with Hartwell's face digitally inserted among groups of actual students. "This is sociopathic," Sarah said, staring at the evidence of systematic deception. "The planning, the attention to detail, the years of maintaining this lie. It's not just resume padding. It's a complete alternate identity." Which explains Why he's so vicious to anyone who might threaten his position, Jennifer added. Women like us represent a fundamental threat to his security. We work hard, we're competent, we ask questions. If the company started promoting based on actual merit instead of fraudulent credentials, people like Hartwell would be exposed. David had created a second timeline tracking Hartwell's career moves, and a disturbing pattern had emerged. Every 3 to 4 years, he'd change companies, usually with a significant title bump and salary increase. Each move coincided with what appeared to be successful projects or initiatives, until they started fact-checking those successes. The Morrison account he's always bragging about? David said, pulling up a news article from the Seattle Business Journal. The turnaround strategy he claims to have developed? It was actually designed by a woman named Rebecca Chen, no relation to our Patricia Chen, who worked under him at his previous company. She never got credit because she left during maternity leave. He's been stealing credit for other people's work for years, Sarah realized, the full scope of Hartwell's fraud finally becoming clear. Specifically women's work. Women who couldn't fight back because they were marginalized or forced out. The psychological profile that emerged was of a man driven by profound insecurity, someone who'd built an elaborate defense system against his own inadequacy. Every lie required additional lies to support it. Every stolen achievement demanded the silencing of its true creator. The harassment, the discrimination, the systematic destruction of women's careers. It wasn't just misogyny, though it certainly was that. It was the necessary maintenance of a fraudulent identity that couldn't survive scrutiny. We need more than just proof of his fake credentials, Sarah said, rubbing her belly as the baby settled into a more comfortable position. We need to show the pattern of abuse, the institutional enabling, the cost to real people's lives and careers. I've been working on that, Jennifer said. I've reached out to 3 other women who left Sterling under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. 2 of them are willing to talk, off the record for now. Their stories are remarkably similar to mine. And to yours. David looked up from his laptop. How many women do you think he's done this to? Dozens, probably. Maybe more. Jennifer's voice was grim. And not just at Sterling. I found similar patterns at his previous companies. Women who started strong, then suddenly had performance issues, then left. It's like he has a system for identifying threats and neutralizing them. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger, but it was different now. Focused, purposeful, backed by evidence and allies. Then we make sure everyone knows. Not just Sterling, but the entire business community. We make his name synonymous with fraud and abuse. That means going public, David warned. Once we do this, there's no taking it back. Are you sure you're ready for that level of exposure? Sarah looked around their improvised command center, at the stacks of evidence documenting years of systematic deception and abuse. She thought about her daughter, about the world she wanted to create for her, about all the women whose careers had been destroyed to protect one man's elaborate lie. I'm ready, she said. The question is, what's the most effective way to make sure the truth reaches everyone who needs to hear it? Jennifer's voice carried a note of anticipation. I have an idea about that. But it's going to require more courage than any of us have shown so far. As the clock struck midnight and their investigation entered its 4th week, Sarah Mitchell prepared to take the next step toward a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. Sarah knocked softly on Marcus Thompson's office door, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched a manila folder containing what appeared to be routine maternity leave paperwork. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after her humiliation in the conference room, and she had spent the weekend rehearsing this conversation with the precision of a theater actor preparing for opening night. Come in, Marcus called, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone already overwhelmed by the day's responsibilities despite the early hour. At 48, the HR director looked older than his years, his receding hairline and stress-lined face testament to 2 decades of navigating corporate politics, while trying to maintain some semblance of ethical behavior. "Hi, Marcus," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from his cluttered desk. "I wanted to follow up on my maternity leave documentation and make sure everything is properly filed." Marcus looked up from his computer screen, his expression immediately shifting from routine professionalism to something more guarded. Sarah could see the discomfort in his eyes, the same discomfort she'd witnessed in the conference room when Hartwell had verbally eviscerated her. He knew what had happened, knew it was wrong, but had chosen institutional loyalty over moral courage. "Of course," he replied, reaching for the folder she offered. "Though I have to say, Richard mentioned that you might want to consider a more flexible arrangement, perhaps a delayed start date that would minimize disruption to the Morrison account transition." The suggestion hung in the air like a trap. Sarah recognized it for what it was, an attempt to negotiate away her legally protected rights in service of corporate convenience. A month ago, she might have considered it, might have internalized the guilt, and agreed to sacrifice her family time for the sake of appearing committed. But the woman sitting in Marcus's office now was not the same person who had walked into that conference room in tears. "Actually, Marcus, that's partly why I'm here," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I've been reviewing the Family and Medical Leave Act requirements, and I want to make sure Sterling is fully compliant with federal regulations. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstanding about the company's obligations." Marcus's face paled slightly. As HR director, he was acutely aware of the legal minefield surrounding maternity leave, and Sarah's careful phrasing suggested she understood the terrain as well. "Of course we're compliant," he said quickly. "Sterling has always been committed to following all applicable employment laws." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, opening her own copy of the folder and pretending to review the documents. "I was also curious about the background verification procedures for senior management. You know, just to understand how the company ensures all leadership meets the standards we expect from our client-facing executives." The change in Marcus's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His hand froze halfway to his coffee cup, his eyes widened with what looked suspiciously like panic, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the office's moderate temperature. "Background verification?" he repeated, his voice climbing half an octave. "Why would you— what specifically are you asking about?" Sarah had expected this reaction. Jennifer's inside knowledge of Sterling's hiring practices had revealed that Marcus had been cutting corners on executive background checks for years, partly due to budget constraints, and partly due to pressure from senior leadership to expedite the hiring process. Hartwell's fraudulent credentials weren't an anomaly. They were the inevitable result of a systemically flawed process. "Well," Sarah said, maintaining her carefully casual tone, "I've been thinking about Richard's Harvard background and how impressive it must have been during his hiring process. I'm curious about what level of verification Sterling typically does for those kinds of prestigious credentials." Marcus was now visibly sweating. He removed his glasses and began cleaning them with obsessive attention, a nervous tic Sarah had observed during particularly uncomfortable management meetings. "Sarah, I'm not sure why you're asking these questions, but personnel matters are confidential. I can't discuss specific individuals' background verification processes." "Of course not," Sarah agreed. "I'm just speaking generally about company policies. For instance, do you typically contact schools directly to verify degrees or use third-party verification services?" The question hit its target with surgical precision. Marcus's face crumpled into an expression of pure misery, and Sarah realized she was witnessing the moment when a man who had been living with guilty knowledge for years finally understood that his sins were about to be exposed. "Sarah," he said, quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "what exactly do you know?" The question was an admission in itself. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized Marcus was ready to crack, ready to confess to the corner-cutting and willful blindness that had enabled Hartwell's fraud. But she also felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the man across from her, a decent person who had made bad choices and was now facing the consequences. "I know that Richard Hartwell doesn't have an MBA from Harvard," she said gently. "I know his work history is fabricated, and I know that you've been covering for the fact that proper background checks weren't done when he was hired." Marcus put his head in his hands. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "I knew this day would come eventually." "Marcus, I'm not here to destroy you," Sarah said, leaning forward in her chair. "But I need to understand what happened, and I need access to Richard's personnel file. The way he treated me in that meeting, it's not just about discrimination. It's about a fraud who's been abusing women to protect his fake identity." For a long moment, Marcus was silent. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "He was hired during the recession," he said finally. 2008, 2009. We were desperate for senior leadership, and he interviewed brilliantly. His references checked out, his presentation skills were exceptional, and frankly, we needed someone with his supposed credentials. "But you didn't verify the Harvard degree?" "We were told by executive leadership to expedite the process. The board was breathing down Michael Sterling's neck about filling key positions, and Richard seemed like the answer to our prayers. I cut corners. I told myself I'd go back and do proper verification once things settled down, but..." He shrugged, helplessly. Time passed. He started producing results, or what looked like results. By the time I realized the scope of the problem, he was too entrenched to remove without massive disruption. "So you've known for how long?" 3 years, Marcus admitted. "Maybe 4. I started getting suspicious when I tried to use his Harvard connections for a recruiting event, and no one at the alumni office had heard of him. When I dug deeper..." He gestured helplessly. "The whole thing was fabricated, but by then he was a senior VP with major client relationships. I couldn't figure out how to handle it without destroying my own career." Sarah felt the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Marcus wasn't just complicit in Hartwell's fraud. He was trapped by it, unable to expose the truth without admitting his own negligence. It was a perfect system of mutual assured destruction that had protected Hartwell for years. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I'm going to expose Richard's fraud publicly. I have enough evidence to destroy him completely. The question is whether you want to be part of the solution or get dragged down with him." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he reached for his desk drawer and pulled out a key. "His personnel file is in the locked cabinet behind you," he said quietly. "Everything's there. The fabricated references, the fake transcripts, the whole mess. I've been keeping copies of everything. I think partly hoping someone like you would eventually come along." As Sarah stood to unlock the cabinet, Marcus added, "Sarah, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. About the meeting, about not standing up to him, about all of it. You deserved better." Sarah paused, her hand on the cabinet lock. "Then help me make sure no other woman has to go through what I did." The personnel file was even more damning than she had hoped, a comprehensive record of Hartwell's deception and the institutional failures that had enabled it. As she photographed each document with her phone, Sarah felt the final elements of her plan falling into place. She had the evidence, she had allies, and now she had an insider willing to testify to the truth. Richard Hartwell's reign of fraud and abuse was about to come to an end. The coffee shop in Capitol Hill buzzed with the gentle hum of afternoon, conversations, and the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine. Sarah sat at their usual corner table, her laptop open to a shared document that outlined what Jennifer had dubbed Operation Credibility. At 8 months pregnant, Sarah's movements had become more deliberate, more careful, but her mind remained razor-sharp as she reviewed the strategy they'd developed over weeks of clandestine meetings. David arrived first, carrying a cardboard tray with Sarah's decaf latte, Jennifer's black coffee, and his own complicated concoction of oat milk and extra shots. His programmer's methodical nature had proven invaluable in organizing their evidence into a coherent narrative, complete, with timestamps, cross-references, and an ironclad chain of documentation that would be impossible to refute. "Jennifer's running about 10 minutes late," he said, settling into the chair beside Sarah and automatically adjusting her laptop screen to reduce the glare. "She's finishing up a call with Rebecca Chen, the woman whose Morrison account strategy Hartwell stole. Rebecca's willing to go on record if we need her." Sarah nodded, scrolling through their evidence folder one more time. 3 months of investigation had yielded a devastating portfolio: fake transcripts, forged references, stolen project credits, documented harassment complaints that had been buried, and a pattern of discrimination that stretched across multiple companies and nearly 2 decades. They had enough material to destroy Hartwell's career and reputation completely. The question was how to ensure maximum impact while protecting the women who had agreed to come forward. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair slightly disheveled from the October wind. She'd been their strategic mastermind, using her corporate experience and natural cynicism to anticipate Hartwell's likely responses and plan accordingly. As she approached their table, Sarah could see the excitement barely contained beneath her professional demeanor. "Sorry," Jennifer said, sliding into the third chair. "Rebecca wanted to make sure we understood the full scope of what Hartwell did to her. Apparently, he didn't just steal credit for the Morrison strategy. He actively sabotaged her attempts to present it herself, then swooped in with her exact proposal after she was forced out on maternity leave." "Jesus," David muttered. "How many women has this bastard destroyed?" "That's exactly why we need to make this count," Sarah said, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as the baby shifted. "We get one shot at maximum exposure. If we don't hit hard enough, he'll find a way to discredit us and continue the pattern somewhere else." Jennifer opened her own laptop and pulled up a presentation she'd been refining for days. "Which brings us to the LinkedIn Live strategy. I know it sounds unconventional, but hear me out." She clicked to a slide showing engagement statistics and viral content patterns. Traditional media is great, but it's also controllable. Sterling's PR team can limit damage, spin the narrative, maybe even bury the story if they throw enough resources at it. "But a LinkedIn live stream," David said, understanding immediately. "That's unfiltered, real-time, and impossible to control once it's out there." "Exactly. Plus, it reaches exactly the audience we want: business professionals, potential employers, industry leaders who need to know what kind of person Hartwell really is." Jennifer clicked to the next slide, showing a rough timeline. Sarah presents the evidence systematically, starting with the fake credentials and building to the harassment pattern. Professional, factual, devastating. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. The idea of going public had terrified her initially, but weeks of preparation had transformed that fear into something more like anticipation. She was ready to tell her story, ready to expose the truth that had been hidden for too long. "Walk me through the timeline again," she said. Jennifer pulled up a detailed schedule. "We go live next Tuesday at noon, peak lunch hour when professionals are most likely to be scrolling LinkedIn. David will handle the technical setup from your home office. I'll be monitoring comments and sharing the stream to amplify reach. You'll have 30 minutes to present everything before the platform's algorithm starts pushing other content." 30 minutes to destroy a man's career, Sarah mused. It feels almost anticlimactic after everything he's put women through. "The presentation is just the opening salvo," David reminded her. "We've already prepared follow-up materials, a detailed website with all the evidence, contact information for the other victims who are willing to go public, links to employment, lawyers who specialize in discrimination cases. The LinkedIn stream will drive people to the deeper investigation." Jennifer nodded. "And we've coordinated with Patricia Chen at the Seattle Business Journal. She'll have an in-depth article ready to publish immediately after the stream ends." providing journalistic credibility and expanding the reach beyond social media. Sarah reviewed the presentation outline one more time. It was methodical, devastating, and completely factual. Everything Hartwell's career was not. She would start with her own story, the humiliation in the conference room that had sparked the investigation. Then she'd reveal the fake Harvard credentials, the fabricated work history, the stolen achievements. Finally, she'd introduce the pattern of harassment and discrimination, supported by testimony from other victims and documentation from Sterling's own files. "What about retaliation?" David asked, voicing the concern that had been haunting all of them. "Hartwell's not going to take this lying down. He'll try to destroy Sarah's reputation, maybe even file lawsuits." "We've thought about that," Jennifer replied. "Everything we're presenting is documented fact. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. As for professional retaliation, by the time this goes live, Hartwell will be in full damage control mode. He won't have time to orchestrate campaigns against individual victims." Sarah closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the decision settling around her like a mantle. In less than a week, she would transform from a private person into a very public whistleblower. There would be no going back, no returning to the anonymous corporate life she'd known for 5 years. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," she said quietly. "What happens after? Win or lose, my career at Sterling is over. Hartwell's career is definitely over. But what about lasting change? How do we make sure this leads to something bigger than just one man's downfall?" Jennifer smiled, the first genuinely optimistic expression Sarah had seen from her since they'd reconnected. "That's the beautiful part. We're not just exposing Hartwell, we're exposing the system that protected him, the background check failures, the HR complicity, the pattern of institutional enabling. Other companies will have to examine their own practices. Other women will feel empowered to come forward. Plus," David added, "we're creating a template, a playbook for how to investigate and expose corporate fraud and discrimination. The methods we've developed, the evidence standards we've established, other people can use this approach." Sarah felt her daughter kick, as if responding to the conversation about the future they were trying to create. "So Tuesday at noon, we go live and change everything." "Tuesday at noon," Jennifer confirmed, "we burn it all down and see what grows from the ashes." As they gathered their laptops and prepared to leave, Sarah felt the familiar transformation continuing within her. The compliant employee was long gone, replaced by an advocate, an investigator, a woman willing to risk everything for justice. In 6 days, the world would meet this new version of Sarah Mitchell, and nothing would ever be the same. The Sterling and Associates office felt different on Monday morning, as if the very air had become thicker and more oppressive. Sarah sat at her desk, ostensibly reviewing the Morrison account files for what everyone assumed would be her final week before maternity leave, but actually rehearsing the presentation that would destroy Richard Hartwell's career in less than 24 hours. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Stream setup tested 3 times. Everything perfect. You've got this." Another message from Jennifer. "Rebecca Chen confirmed for backup testimony. Legal team standing by. Tomorrow we make history. Sarah." Managed a small smile despite the churning anxiety in her stomach. At 8.5 months pregnant, every emotion felt amplified, every physical sensation more intense. The baby seemed to sense her mother's tension, shifting restlessly throughout the morning as if responding to Sarah's elevated heart rate. "Sarah." Richard Hartwell's voice cut through her concentration like a blade. She looked up to find him, standing beside her desk, his imposing frame casting a shadow across her workspace. His expression carried a mixture of suspicious scrutiny and barely contained irritation that had become his default demeanor over the past week. "Good morning, Richard," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the adrenaline surge his presence triggered. "I need those Morrison transition documents on my desk by noon," he said, his tone suggesting this was somehow already overdue, despite being the first she'd heard of the deadline. "We're moving up the client handoff timeline." Sarah's pulse quickened. The sudden urgency felt calculated, designed to overwhelm her with impossible demands during her final days. It was a strategy she'd seen him employ before, burying perceived threats under avalanches of busy work while positioning himself as the only person capable of maintaining order. "Of course," she said, opening the relevant files on her computer. "Though I should mention that the transition documents are quite comprehensive. It might take some time to figure it out," Hartwell interrupted. "You wanted maternity leave. Sarah, the least you can do is ensure your departure doesn't leave the rest of us scrambling to fix your messes." The casual cruelty of the comment hit its intended target. Around the office, colleagues pretended not to hear while stealing uncomfortable glances in their direction. Sarah felt the familiar humiliation rising in her throat, the same shame that had paralyzed her in that conference room 3 months ago. But this time was different. This time, she knew exactly who Richard Hartwell really was. "I'll have everything ready," she said quietly, meeting his gaze with steady confidence that seemed to unsettle him. Hartwell studied her face for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for signs of weakness or rebellion. Finding neither, he turned and walked away, but Sarah could feel his attention lingering like a physical weight on her shoulders. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of artificial urgency. Hartwell found excuses to stop by her desk every 30 minutes, ostensibly checking on her progress, but actually applying psychological pressure. He questioned her methodology, criticized her formatting, and suggested that her condition might be affecting her judgment, all delivered with the practiced smile of someone who had perfected the art of professional abuse. By lunchtime, Sarah's stress levels had reached a dangerous peak. Her hands were shaking as she tried to type, and she could feel her blood pressure rising in a way that couldn't be healthy for the baby. When Hartwell appeared for his fourth check-in of the day, she realized she needed to remove herself from the situation before something went wrong. "I need to step out for a quick appointment," she announced, gathering her purse and coat. "I'll finish the documents this afternoon." "What kind of appointment?" Hartwell demanded, his mask of professional concern slipping to reveal naked irritation. "Prenatal checkup," Sarah replied, which was technically true. She'd scheduled a brief visit with her obstetrician to ensure the stress wasn't affecting her pregnancy. "Of course," Hartwell said with exaggerated sympathy that fooled no one within earshot. "Though I have to say, Sarah, it's concerning how many medical appointments you've needed lately. Some might question whether you're really committed to finishing your projects before abandoning your responsibilities." The word abandoning hit like a slap. Sarah felt something snap inside her, a final thread of tolerance that had been fraying for months. She turned to face Hartwell directly, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. "Richard, I've never missed a deadline in 5 years. I've exceeded every performance metric the company has established. I've sacrificed evenings, weekends, and personal time to ensure client satisfaction. If you're questioning my commitment, perhaps you should examine whether your management style is creating unnecessary stress for pregnant employees." The response clearly caught Hartwell off guard. For a moment, his practiced composure faltered, revealing something that looked almost like panic beneath the surface arrogance. Sarah realized he wasn't just suspicious. He was afraid. Some instinct was telling him that danger was approaching, even if he couldn't identify its exact nature. "I think the stress of your condition might be affecting your judgment," he said, finally, his voice carrying a threatening undertone. "Perhaps we should discuss adjusting your remaining timeline here to ensure a smooth transition for everyone." Sarah understood the implicit threat. He was considering firing her before she could take maternity leave, finding some pretext to eliminate what he perceived as a growing problem. It was exactly the kind of illegal retaliation that had driven other women out of the company, and exactly the kind of behavior she would expose in less than 24 hours. "I'll be back this afternoon to complete the documents," she said simply, walking past him toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind her, Sarah saw Hartwell standing. In the middle of the office, his expression troubled and suspicious. He was a predator sensing danger but unable to identify its source, a position that clearly made him increasingly desperate and unpredictable. During her brief doctor's appointment, Sarah explained the increased stress and her concerns about completing the pregnancy safely. Dr. Martinez, who had been monitoring her throughout the pregnancy, was reassuring but firm about the need to manage her stress levels. "Your blood pressure is elevated, but not dangerously so," she said, reviewing the test results. "However, I'm concerned about the psychological stress you're describing. Is there any way to reduce the workplace pressure during these final weeks?" Sarah almost laughed at the irony. "Actually, yes. After tomorrow, I think the pressure will be significantly reduced." When she returned to the office that afternoon, Sarah found her desk had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted to a more visible location where Hartwell could observe her from his office window. The petty intimidation tactic would have devastated her 3 months ago. Now it simply confirmed that she was making the right choice. She completed the Morrison transition documents with methodical precision, knowing they would be the last work she ever produced for Sterling and Associates. As she saved the final files and prepared to leave for the day, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. Tomorrow she would speak truth to power in front of thousands of witnesses. Tomorrow she would expose the fraud and abuse that had thrived in corporate shadows for too long. Tomorrow she would risk everything for the chance to create real change. Tonight, she would go home to David, practice her presentation one final time, and prepare to step into a future she could barely imagine. The scared employee who had walked into Hartwell's conference room 3 months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone far more dangerous to men like him, a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Sarah's hands were surprisingly steady as she adjusted the camera angle one final time. The home office that had served as their investigation headquarters for months had been transformed into a professional broadcast studio, with David's technical expertise ensuring perfect lighting and crystal-clear audio. At 11:58 a.m. on Tuesday, everything was ready for the moment that would change all their lives forever. "Audio levels are perfect," David said from his position behind the camera setup, his voice carrying the calm focus he brought to debugging complex code. "You've got this, Sarah. Remember, just speak to the camera like you're talking to a friend." Jennifer's voice came through the speakerphone from her apartment across town, where she was monitoring social media and preparing to amplify the stream's reach. "Viewer count is already at 200 and climbing. Word is spreading through professional networks faster than we anticipated." Sarah smoothed her navy maternity blouse, the same one she'd worn to that fateful meeting with Hartwell 3 months ago, and took a deep breath. At nearly 9 months pregnant, she felt the baby's gentle movements, as if their daughter was offering encouragement for what was about to unfold. "Going live in 30 seconds, David announced, his finger hovering over the start button. The red recording light activated, and Sarah looked directly into the camera with the composure of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. "Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a senior marketing executive at Sterling and Associates here in Seattle. I'm going live today to share information that the business community, and specifically women in corporate America, needs to hear about systematic fraud and discrimination in the workplace." The viewer count was climbing rapidly, 400, 600, 800 people joining the stream in real time. Comments began flowing. Colleagues from Sterling, industry professionals, complete strangers drawn by the gravity of her opening statement. 3 months ago, I requested legally mandated maternity leave from my supervisor, Richard Hartwell, Senior Vice President at Sterling and Associates. Instead of the routine approval I expected, I was publicly humiliated, mocked for wanting to become a mother, and told that my commitment to the company was questionable because of my pregnancy. Sarah's voice remained steady, professional, letting the facts speak for themselves without emotional manipulation. She could see the comment stream accelerating, colleagues confirming they'd witnessed the meeting, women sharing their own similar experiences, industry leaders expressing shock and support. That humiliation led me to investigate the man who had treated me so cruelly, and what I discovered was a pattern of systematic fraud and abuse that has been hidden for nearly 2 decades. She clicked to her first slide, a side-by-side comparison of Hartwell's LinkedIn profile and the actual academic records David had uncovered. Richard Hartwell claims to have earned an MBA from Harvard Business School in 1995. Harvard has no record of Richard Hartwell ever attending their institution. His degree is completely fabricated. The comment stream exploded. Former Harvard students confirming the alumni network had no knowledge of him. Sterling employees expressing shock. Industry professionals beginning to share the stream across their own networks. Viewer count, 1,200 and climbing. The fraudulent credentials were just the beginning, Sarah continued, advancing to the next slide showing Hartwell's work history. Mr. Hartwell claims to have worked at McKinsey & Company from 1995 to 1998. McKinsey has no record of his employment. He claims to have held senior positions at Goldman Sachs from 1998 to 2002. Those positions never existed. She methodically presented each piece of evidence, the fake references, the stolen project credits, the elaborate network of lies that had sustained Hartwell's career for decades. Her presentation was surgical in its precision, each revelation building upon the last to create an overwhelming case of professional fraud. But the fraudulent credentials enabled something even more damaging, Sarah said, transitioning to the harassment documentation. Mr. Hartwell has used his fake authority to systematically discriminate against women, particularly those who might threaten his fraudulent position. Jennifer's research appeared on screen. Carefully anonymized accounts from multiple victims, documentation of harassment complaints that had been buried, patterns of retaliation against women who had challenged his behavior. Jennifer Walsh, former Sterling employee, was forced to leave after reporting sexual harassment that the company failed to investigate properly. Rebecca Chen's successful project strategies were stolen and credited to Mr. Hartwell after she was pushed out during maternity leave. These are not isolated incidents. They represent a systematic pattern of abuse enabled by institutional protection, of fraudulent leadership. The viewer count had passed 2,000. Sarah could see through the comments that the stream was being shared across multiple platforms: Twitter, Facebook, industry forums. Screenshots were being posted, evidence was being preserved, and the story was spreading far beyond LinkedIn's platform. "I'm sharing this information not for revenge, but for accountability," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she reached the climax of her presentation. Richard Hartwell has built his entire career on lies, stolen credit from women's work, and used his fraudulent authority to abuse and discriminate against female employees. The companies that have employed him, the clients who have trusted him, and the women whose careers he has destroyed deserve to know the truth. David held up a sign indicating 5 minutes remaining. Sarah advanced to her final slides: contact information for employment lawyers, resources for discrimination victims, and a call to action for systematic change in corporate hiring and accountability practices. To other women who have faced similar treatment, you are not alone, your experiences matter, and change is possible when we have the courage to speak truth to power. To employers, verify credentials, investigate complaints thoroughly, and understand that protecting fraudulent leaders ultimately damages everyone in your organization. The comment stream was now moving too fast to read, filled with support, shares, and promises to investigate similar patterns at other companies. The viewer count approached 3,000, with new people joining every second as the story spread across professional networks. To Richard Hartwell, your decades of fraud and abuse end today. The truth is now public, documented, and undeniable. Sarah looked directly into the camera for her final statement, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had risked everything for justice. My daughter will be born into a world where women's voices matter, where truth prevails over fraudulent authority, and where systemic change is possible when ordinary people find the courage to fight extraordinary injustice. Thank you for watching, and thank you for sharing this story with others who need to hear it. The stream ended to a cascade of comments, shares, and support that would continue growing for hours. Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. In 30 minutes, she had destroyed a career built on decades of lies and opened a conversation about workplace accountability that would ripple across industries. Her phone immediately began buzzing with calls and messages. David wrapped her in a gentle hug, whispering congratulations and relief. Jennifer's excited voice came through the speakerphone, reporting that major news outlets were already reaching out for follow-up stories. The battle was won, but Sarah Mitchell understood that the war for workplace justice was just beginning. The first 24 hours after the LinkedIn live stream felt like living inside a hurricane. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the moment she ended the broadcast, and their home had become an impromptu command center for managing a story that had exploded far beyond their wildest expectations. By 6 p.m. Tuesday, the stream had been viewed over 15,000 times and shared across every major social media platform. Patricia Chen's article in the Seattle Business Journal had been picked up by the Associated Press, and requests for interviews were pouring in from CNN, NPR, and the Wall Street Journal. The hashtag #OurCredibilityTrap was trending on Twitter, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination and fraud. Sterling's stock price dropped 3% in after-hours trading, David reported from his laptop, where he was monitoring the financial and media fallout. The board called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Sarah sat on their couch, her feet elevated to manage the swelling that had worsened with the stress of the day. At 9 months pregnant, every emotion felt amplified, every development, both exhilarating and overwhelming. She was scrolling through hundreds of messages from women who had faced similar treatment, each story a reminder of why she had taken this enormous risk. Jennifer burst through their front door carrying bags of takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant. "I figured you wouldn't have time to cook," she said, her face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. "Sarah, do you realize what you've accomplished? This isn't just about Hartwell anymore. It's become a movement." She was right. The LinkedIn comments had evolved into a comprehensive indictment of corporate America's failure to address systematic discrimination and fraud. Women were sharing stories about fake credentials they'd discovered, harassment they'd endured, and careers they'd lost to protect incompetent men. Employment lawyers were offering pro bono services. HR professionals were calling for industry-wide reforms. "Any word from Sterling directly?" Sarah asked, accepting a container of pad thai despite having little appetite. "Radio silence from official channels," Jennifer replied. "But I've been getting texts from current employees all day." Hartwell was escorted out of the building at 2 p.m. Security cleared his office while he waited in the lobby. Marcus Thompson has been in meetings with the executive team since this afternoon. Sarah felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sympathy. Hartwell's decades of fraud and abuse were finally catching up with him, but she couldn't help thinking about the collateral damage. His wife Angela, whose social media empire was built on lies, the clients who had trusted his expertise, even Hartwell himself, whose insecurities had driven him to construct such an elaborate deception. Her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Sarah Mitchell? This is Patricia Chen from the Seattle Business Journal. I know we've been coordinating through Jennifer, but I wanted to speak with you directly about some developments." "Of course," Sarah said, putting the call on speaker so David and Jennifer could listen. "I've been contacted by representatives from 3 different law firms specializing in corporate fraud. They're interested in filing civil suits against Sterling for enabling Hartwell's deception and creating a hostile work environment. There's also interest from the SEC regarding potential securities fraud. If Hartwell was claiming fake credentials in materials used to secure client contracts, that could constitute federal violations. The scope of the legal implications was staggering. Sarah had expected professional consequences for Hartwell, but the possibility of criminal charges and federal investigations suggested the story would continue evolving for months or even years. There's something else, Patricia continued. I've been researching Hartwell's previous employers, and I'm finding similar patterns at every company he's worked for over the past 20 years. Women who left suddenly, projects that were reassigned, harassment complaints that disappeared. You've exposed the tip of an iceberg, Sarah. After ending the call, the three of them sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they had unleashed. Sarah's investigation into one man's fraud had revealed a systematic failure that implicated multiple corporations and potentially dozens of victims. Are you okay with all this? David asked quietly, his protective instincts clearly activated by the growing intensity of public attention. We can scale back, refer media requests to Jennifer, try to maintain some privacy. Sarah considered the question seriously. The past 24 hours had transformed her from a private person into a very public figure, and there would be no returning to anonymity. Every Google search of her name would forever link her to this story. Her daughter would grow up knowing her mother as the woman who exposed Richard Hartwell's fraud. I'm okay, she said finally. Actually, I'm more than okay. I'm proud of what we've accomplished. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown local number. Sarah almost ignored it, but something prompted her to answer. Is this Sarah Mitchell? The voice was female, hesitant, vaguely familiar. Yes, this is Sarah. This is Angela Hartwell, Richard's wife. I was wondering if we could talk. The request was so unexpected that Sarah found herself speechless for a moment. Angela Hartwell, the social media influencer whose entire brand was built around being married to a Harvard MBA, whose lifestyle content celebrated the success that had been built on lies. Of course, Sarah said, curiosity overcoming caution. When and where? Could we meet tonight? I know it's late notice, but I've been watching the coverage all day, and I need to understand what my life has been built on. They arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop in Angela's neighborhood, away from anywhere they might encounter reporters or Sterling employees. Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension as she prepared for a conversation she couldn't have imagined. 24 hours earlier. The coffee shop was nearly empty at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Angela was easy to spot, her platinum blonde hair and designer clothing marking her as distinctly out of place in the casual neighborhood establishment. But her usual polished confidence was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she looked vulnerable, confused, almost broken. Thank you for meeting me, Angela said as Sarah approached her table. I wasn't sure you would, given everything that's happened. I wasn't sure either, Sarah admitted, settling carefully into the chair across from her. At 9 months pregnant, every movement required consideration, and she was acutely aware of how the stress of the day was affecting her body. I need you to know that I had no idea, Angela began, her voice barely above a whisper. About the Harvard degree, about McKinsey, about any of it. My entire adult life has been built around supporting Richard's career, celebrating achievements that apparently never happened. Sarah studied Angela's face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only genuine distress. How much did you know about his treatment of women at work? Nothing specific. He would complain about difficult employees, about people who weren't team players, but he never. Angela paused, seeming to reconsider her words. Actually, that's not entirely true. He talked about women differently than men. He would say things about female colleagues being emotional or using their gender to get ahead, or being distracted by family issues. I thought it was just workplace frustration. Angela, you're Husband has been systematically harassing and discriminating against women for decades. He's destroyed careers, stolen credit for other people's work, and used his fraudulent credentials to justify abuse of power. Angela's composure finally cracked, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. I built my entire brand around being married to a successful Harvard businessman. My followers, my sponsorships, my consulting business, everything is connected to that identity. What am I supposed to do now? Sarah felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the woman across from her. Angela was another victim of Hartwell's deception, perhaps the most intimate victim of all. Her marriage, her career, her public identity, everything was built on the same lies that had enabled his professional fraud. You start over, Sarah said gently. You build something real, something authentic, something that doesn't depend on someone else's stolen achievements. I want to help, Angela said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. I want to support the women he's hurt. I don't know how, but I need to do something to make this right. Then help us understand the full scope of his deception. Help us identify other women who might have been affected. Use your platform to amplify their voices instead of celebrating the achievements he stole from them. As they parted ways an hour later, Sarah realized that the story was far from over. Hartwell's exposure was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning with corporate fraud, systematic discrimination, and the cultures that enable both. Her daughter would be born into a world where these conversations were happening openly, where women's voices carried weight, where truth mattered more than fraudulent credentials. The hurricane was still raging, but Sarah Mitchell was no longer just surviving it. She was directing its path toward real, lasting change. 3 months later, Sarah sat in the sunny nursery of their Capitol Hill home, her daughter Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. The morning light filtered through curtains that had been drawn tight during those intense weeks following the LinkedIn exposé, when reporters and cameras had made their quiet street feel like a media circus. Now, in the gentle calm of early motherhood, Sarah could finally reflect on everything that had changed since that fateful Tuesday afternoon. The legal consequences for Richard Hartwell had been swift and comprehensive. Sterling & Associates had terminated him within 48 hours of the live stream, and criminal charges for fraud and identity theft were still pending. The SEC investigation had expanded to include 3 of his former employers, and civil lawsuits from affected women were moving through the courts with the support of high-profile employment law firms who had taken the cases pro bono. More importantly, to Sarah, the cultural impact had exceeded her wildest expectations. The hashtag credibility trap had evolved into a broader movement for corporate accountability, with companies across industries implementing more rigorous background verification processes and anonymous reporting systems for discrimination complaints. Harvard Business School had even launched a new initiative to help employers verify alumni credentials, citing Sarah's investigation as a catalyst for addressing widespread credential fraud. Emma stirred in her arms, her tiny fist uncurling to reveal perfect miniature fingers that seemed to grasp at the future they were building for her. Sarah smiled, thinking about the world her daughter would inherit. A world where women's voices carried weight, where systematic fraud couldn't hide behind institutional protection, where courage like hers could inspire real change. The interview. Crew just pulled up, David called from downstairs. Are you ready for this? Sarah looked at herself in the nursery mirror, adjusting the professional blazer she'd chosen for today's appearance on 60 Minutes. The national news program had been following the Hartwell story since the beginning, and today's segment would mark the 3-month anniversary of the exposé with a comprehensive look at the lasting impact of one woman's decision to speak truth to power. Ready? She called back, carefully transferring Emma to her crib before heading downstairs to meet the camera crew. The living room had been transformed into a television studio, with professional lighting and multiple cameras positioned to capture what producer Margaret Williams had promised would be a thoughtful examination of workplace accountability in corporate America. Sarah had agreed to the interview partly to maintain momentum for the reforms they had set in motion, and partly because she wanted Emma to someday see a record of why her mother had risked everything for justice. "Sarah, thank you for agreeing to this follow-up interview," said correspondent Leslie Stahl as they settled into chairs positioned near the window. "3 months ago, you went live on LinkedIn with allegations that destroyed a man's career and sparked a national conversation about corporate fraud. Looking back, do you have any regrets?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The past 3 months had been intense beyond anything she could have imagined. The legal proceedings, the media attention, the constant stream of women reaching out with their own stories of workplace discrimination. It had been overwhelming at times, especially while navigating new motherhood. But regrets? "None," she said firmly. "Richard Hartwell built his career on lies and used those lies to harm women for decades. The only regret I have is that it took so long for someone to expose him." "The legal consequences have been significant," Leslie continued. "Hartwell faces potential criminal charges. Sterling and Associates has settled multiple discrimination lawsuits, and the SEC investigation has implicated several other companies. But you've said the real victory isn't about punishing one man, it's about systematic change. Can you explain what you mean?" Sarah nodded, thinking about the emails she received daily from HR professionals, employment lawyers, and working mothers who had been inspired to speak up about their own experiences. Individual accountability is important, but it's not enough. We needed to change the culture that enabled Hartwell in the first place. The assumption that prestigious credentials automatically confer authority, the willingness to overlook red flags when someone presents, well, the systematic silencing of women who raise concerns. The interview continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from the investigation techniques they had used to the broader implications for corporate governance. Sarah spoke about the importance of allies like David and Jennifer, the courage required to go public with such explosive allegations, and her hopes for the future workplace culture that Emma would inherit. "There's been some criticism," Leslie said toward the end of the interview, "that your approach was unnecessarily public, that these issues should have been handled through internal channels or private legal proceedings. How do you respond to that?" Sarah felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest, the same determination that had driven her through those long nights of investigation and the terror of going live before thousands of strangers. "Internal channels failed," she said flatly. "Private legal proceedings protect the institutions that enable fraud and abuse. The only way to create real accountability is through public exposure. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and women like Jennifer Walsh, Rebecca Chen, and dozens of others deserve to have their stories heard publicly after being silenced privately for so long." After the camera crew left, Sarah found herself standing in Emma's nursery again, watching her daughter sleep with the peaceful innocence of someone who would grow up in a world shaped by her mother's courage. The afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the room, and Sarah could hear David downstairs fielding calls from reporters, advocacy groups, and law firms who wanted updates on various aspects of the ongoing legal proceedings. Her phone buzzed, with a text from Jennifer. "Watching the interview live feed. You're incredible. Coffee tomorrow to discuss the new consulting project?" Sarah smiled, thinking about the workplace equity consulting firm that she and Jennifer were launching together. They'd received dozens of requests from companies wanting help implementing better background verification procedures, creating safer reporting mechanisms for discrimination complaints, and building cultures where truth mattered more than credentials. It wasn't the career path Sarah had planned when she first requested maternity leave from Richard Hartwell, but it felt like the work she was meant to do. Another message came in, this one from Angela Hartwell, saw the interview announcement. "Proud of you for continuing to speak out. My divorce proceedings are moving forward, and I'm testifying in the SEC case next week. Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." The transformation in Angela had been remarkable to witness. After that first tearful meeting in the IET coffee shop, she had become one of the most effective advocates for Hartwell's victims, using her social media platform to amplify their stories and her insider knowledge to help investigators understand the full scope of his deception. Her marriage was ending. Her lifestyle brand was being rebuilt around authentic advocacy rather than fraudulent achievements, but she seemed genuinely happier than Sarah had ever seen her. Emma began to stir, making the small sounds that indicated she would soon wake up hungry and demanding attention. Sarah prepared to lift her daughter from the crib, but paused for a moment to appreciate the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. 3 months ago, she had been a pregnant marketing executive with a comfortable but unremarkable corporate career. Today, she was a nationally recognized advocate for workplace justice, the co-founder of a consulting firm dedicated to corporate accountability, and most importantly, the mother of a daughter who would inherit a world where systematic fraud and discrimination were harder to hide and easier to challenge. The phone rang downstairs, probably another reporter or lawyer or advocacy group wanting to discuss some aspect of the ongoing movement that had grown from her decision to speak truth to power. David would handle it, as he had handled hundreds of similar calls over the past 3 months, protecting their family's privacy while supporting Sarah's transformed role as a public figure. As she lifted Emma from the crib and settled into the nursing chair by the window, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. The humiliation in Richard Hartwell's conference room had felt like the end of her professional world. Instead, it had been the beginning of something far more important, a career dedicated to ensuring that other women wouldn't face the same systematic silencing and abuse. Emma latched on eagerly, her tiny hand curling around Sarah's finger with the instinctive trust of someone who had never known a world where her mother's voice didn't matter. Outside, Seattle bustled with its usual energy, full of corporate offices where background checks were now more thorough, reporting mechanisms more robust, and women's complaints taken more seriously because one pregnant marketing executive had found the courage to fight back. The credibility trap that had snared Richard Hartwell and the institutions that protected him was broken. In its place, Sarah Mitchell had helped build something better. A world where truth mattered more than fraudulent credentials, where women's voices carried weight, and where systematic change was possible when ordinary people found extraordinary courage. As Emma drifted back to sleep in her arms, Sarah smiled at the future they were creating together. Mother and daughter, advocates and changemakers, living proof that speaking truth to power could transform not just individual lives, but the entire system that had tried to silence them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.